Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The course that we are discussing today is Social Policy, and the specific module under discussion is Agrarian Issues. I am Sohini Sengupta. I am a faculty in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Agriculture is of key concern for India, not just in the context of social policy, but also broader development goals. While more than half of India's population of 1.3 billion is engaged in agriculture and allied sectors, the contribution of agriculture to national income has been rapidly declining in recent times. This has led to growing concern amongst observers and commentators in this area because if you remember the previous module, we have been talking about the fact that India's achievement in food security is closely connected to agricultural development that we have seen in the post-independence period. Over the past decades, thousands of indebted farmers have also been committing suicide in India, and that has highlighted, again through democratic action and free press, the concern that perhaps all was not well with the agricultural sector. Shifts in the structure of agriculture affects the livelihoods of the poorest in our country. Forces responsible for these shifts can be economic reforms, trade liberalization, environmental pressures, land fragmentation, climatic stress, and pest resistance of crops. Increasing poverty effects in food security make agrarian issues a key social policy concern. The specific objectives of this module are: learn about agrarian issues in the country, to understand the nature of smallholder cultivation, since most farmers in our country cultivate very small pieces of land. Try and understand the kind of state support that is provided to farmers. Specifically look at agricultural price support policies and the implication for food security. According to the 2011 census, nearly half the workforce in India are dependent on agricultural livelihoods. From 2001 to 2011, however, the number of cultivators have declined, which essentially means that 8.9 million farmers are no longer farming. During the same period, the number of agricultural workers have increased, which means 36.9 million people became agricultural workers. This essentially means that farmers, this is one indication that a very large group of people are dependent on a highly insecure type of employment, which is agricultural wage labor. For the poorest population group, dependence on agriculture through wage labor employment and the use of common pool resources also creates indirect dependence on issues such as access to cheap food. So agriculture does not only provide employment to poorer social groups, but also perhaps contributes to the food security. In the context of India, agriculture fulfills two purposes, and which is why we are discussing it in a course on social policy. One is employment generation, and the second is poverty reduction. Agricultural growth contributes to poverty reduction through direct impact on wage rates and indirect impact by increasing employment. For food security, increase in domestic supply of agricultural production is necessary to be able to provide food not just to the poor but all the citizens of the country. Increasing supply is also needed for the success of the public distribution system that we discussed in the previous module on food security. Agricultural livelihoods, however, suffer from a large number of shortcomings in the present context. There's a high levels of casual wage labor, which means, if you remember our module on informal work, these are not very secure sources of employment. The streams of income from such an employment is very irregular and very low. Low and less than minimum wages and insufficient work days, absence of formal social security mechanisms, agricultural workers are not covered very well under any labor laws in the country. Labor bondage and patron-client relationships thrive. Competition is there from seasonal wage labor gangs, which leads to further depression in the wages of casual workers in agriculture. Interlocked markets for labor and credit means that people are often locked in cycles of indebtedness and poverty, and they have to keep working in agriculture because they have no alternative. The goal of agriculture is essentially, as a sector, is to provide raw material for the economy and people, for employment generation, for poverty reduction, agricultural growth. What does the statistics show? India is the largest producer of milk, pulses, spices and has the world's largest cattle herd. It has the largest area under wheat, rice and cotton in the world. It is the second largest producer of rice, wheat, cotton, sugarcane, farmed fish, sheep, goat, meat, fruit, vegetables and tea. If you want to look at it in terms of areas under cultivation, 195 million hectares are being farmed in India. Within this, 63% of the cultivated land is actually rain-fed, which means it does not have access to any secured sources of irrigation and is dependent on seasonal monsoonal rains, which means in any particular year when distribution of monsoon is erratic or when rains fail, farmers stand to lose a great deal through loss of incomes and crop loss. Irrigation covers only 37% of the total cropped area. Forests cover about 65 million hectares of land. Some amount of farming and some amount of food gathering also takes place in the forest. Issues and concerns in agriculture. The rise of food grain production during India's Green Revolution of the 1970s enabled the country to achieve self-sufficiency in food grains and stave off famines. Agricultural intensification in the 1970s to 80s saw an increased demand for rural labor that raised rural wages and together with declining food prices reduced rural poverty. Therefore, we can see a direct relationship between improving agricultural growth to increasing agricultural wage rates and the reduction of poverty. However, agricultural growth in the 1990s and 2000s have slowed down. It averages only about 3.5% per annum, and cereal yields have increased only by 1.4% per annum in the 2000s. This essentially means that agricultural productivity as well as yields are declining in the country. The slowdown in agricultural growth has become a major cause of concern. India's rice yields are 1/3 of China's and about half of those of Vietnam and in Indonesia, which constantly makes policymakers and observers to worry about where the Indian agriculture is headed in future, and do we not perhaps need another green revolution? Farmers' suicides have compounded the problems with which agriculture as a sector is associated in our country nowadays. Hundreds of distress-driven farmers affected by low returns on agriculture and high indebtedness have been periodically taking their lives. Farmer suicides have highlighted the crisis in India's agriculture. According to some commentators, this crisis is actually linked to the declining state support or declining state attention to agriculture as a sector in the current period. A quick look at the kind of land holdings that farmers have in the country, which are not very huge. 85% of the operated holding are less than 2 hectares. 66% of all holdings is under 1 hectare. If we compare average size of holding to different countries in the world, and if you look at Africa, in Africa, average holding size is about 12 hectares. In America, North and Central, it's about 117 hectares. In South America, it's 74 hectares. In Europe, about 12 hectares. In Asia, in general, average land holding site is 1 hectare. This is supposed to be a characteristic of rice farming economies of Asia. Farm sizes below 2 hectares are considered to be small holding. So we can safely say that most farmers in India are smallholders. A quick look at the farm classifications in India. This is obtained from the Agricultural Census of India 2010-2011, which provides all this data in great detail and much more. Marginal farmers are those who have land below 0.5 hectares up to 1 hectare. Small farmers are those who have land holding between 1 to 2 hectares. Semi-medium, medium and large are the other categories of farmers. This classification is based on operated holdings, which means land that is used either partly or completely for agricultural production and operated technically as a unit by one person or persons. Shifts in farm size. The discussion in farm size is important to understand why agricultural productivity is perhaps declining and why farmers perhaps don't have as much bargaining power as they had in the past. Average farm size declined from 1.23 to 1.15 hectares in the country. Share of women farmers have increased. Small and marginal holdings have also increased from 83% to 85%. and share of operated area under small and marginal farms have also increased. Farms are becoming smaller and farmers are getting poorer. That's the understanding that we get from looking at this broader data. How many farmers do we have and where do they live? The poorest people in the world, especially in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, are land-based farming households. So basically, if you're a farmer and if you're land-based, and especially if you're a small farmer, the likelihood of you being poor is very high. Worldwide, 410 million farms are less than 1 hectare in size. If we compare China and India, there are 200 million farming households and 425 million agricultural workers in China. If you look at in India, we have 90.2 million agricultural households and 144 million agricultural workers. Like India, China also has a policy of food self-sufficiency and grows 95% of the food grains required to feed its population. A quick look at the statistics on what is happening to the trends of farmers in the country. If you look at cultivators in the country based on a recent census report, we can see that between 1951 and 2011, the number of cultivators have increased, decreased, but there hasn't been significant change. Over a period of time, cultivator numbers have actually increased overall because of more and more farms splitting up and creation of smaller and smaller farms. If you look at cultivators as the percentage of workforce, however, between 1951 and 2011, there has been a steady decline, which means large number of working age populations no longer work in the sector of agriculture. If you look at the number of agricultural labor, there has been a huge increase, which means that in 1951, the number was only 27.3%, but if you look at 2011, you have 144 million people working as agricultural labor as against 27 million in 1951. So there has been a huge increase in total number of people working as agricultural laborers. The percentage of agricultural laborers have also increased from 19% to 30%. Key debates in agriculture. Who are the small farmers? What is the future of smallholder cultivation? Is smallholder farming efficient and productive? Is smallholder farming environmentally sustainable? What is the role of smallholder farming in rural poverty alleviation and household food security? These are the questions that we need to ask if we have to find the correct policy measures to address the issue of farming. Some more questions. What kind of state support does farming need? How do global trade regimes affect agriculture? Is farming getting transformed? Why? In what ways? What is the role of women and other disadvantaged groups? What is the land grab debate and how do we protect community rights over natural resources? Small farmers are no longer viewed as pre-capitalist peasants outside capitalist social relations. Instead, they are studied and understood as petty commodity producers. However, most of them, the rural masses, cannot reproduce themselves primarily through their own farming. Essentially, this means that farmers no longer just farm, they have to balance a range of diversified livelihoods in order to cope with the seasonal and other forms of income insecurities. They are members of classes of labor who reproduce themselves primarily through wage labor, with an element of subsistence coming from their own farming. From a pro-market perspective, as per capita income rises and economies diversify, workers leave agriculture, rural wages go up, and it is more efficient to have progressively larger and more mechanized farms. Is this scenario applicable and would it work for India, for example? To survive in such a context, small farms need to undergo major types of transformation. This could mean that they buy or rent additional land to increase their holding size. They diversify into higher value production activity. Instead of growing staple food grains, for example, they grow more high value crops. Diversify into non-farm sources of income and employment. In the long run, few small farms survive. And this is giving rise to what is known as the phenomena of part-time farmers in Asia who are barely managing to control the work of their small farm. Are smallholders efficient? A large number of empirical studies have shown that an inverse relationship between farm size and land productivity. Small farms, unlike large mechanized ones, acquire higher productivity at lower capital intensities as compared to large farms. This is primarily due to the abundance of family labor per hectare farmed. Labor-intensive methods are a strength in labor surplus economies and becomes a weakness when labor becomes more expensive. This essentially means that as long as there are people looking for wage work in any country context, including in India, small farms would continue to remain efficient because quite a lot of labor will come from families. The moment labor has other sources to secure employment and leave farming, small farms might find it very difficult to balance higher input costs, smaller size of holdings, and high expense of wage laborers. Smallholder farmings and concerns of social justice. Development of small farms can help the rural poor. Through egalitarian distribution of land, promotes economic growth. It enhances food security by increasing local supplies and creating national surpluses. It also provides a basis for diversifying rural livelihoods. It's much easier for small farmers to diversify into other forms of livelihood than a landless casual wage worker who does not have any asset base. Problems of smallholder farming. End of small farms does not drive economic growth but emerges sometimes as a consequence of it. If small farmers are forced to exit before adequate non-farm jobs are available, this would essentially lead to worsening of poverty and unwanted levels of rural to urban migration, leading to greater concentration of poverty in urban areas. The present drivers of farm size transition, which is consumer driven, market driven, or liberalization or globalization, this leads to small farmers having to compete with demanding markets at home and overseas as they try to diversify into high value products. Not all farms survive this competition. What are the main risks for smallholder farmers? Greater competition from international trade and lower crop prices, privatization of seed and input supply systems, absence of support in agricultural research, all of this disadvantages small farm. Access to land, credit, technology and markets, and absence of subsidized public input delivery system also hampers the possibility of small farms to become competitive and efficient in the present scenario of liberalized market economies. State support. When there are too many small farms, the argument goes whose incomes are below national average. There is pressure on government to create protectionist policies, which essentially means you have a country of large number of small farmers and large number of people dependent on casual agricultural wage work, then the government needs to have policies to protect them. In India, small farm-led green revolution strategy led to economic growth and poverty alleviation. Here, input subsidies provided by the government played a very important role. Public investment in small-scale subsistence farming is more cost-effective than many other income transfer or social safety nets. And here we find another connection with social policy. If a government can help support farmers through other means, then the same population would not become a class of disinherited poor persons whom the government would then have to support through creating social safety nets, social risk management programs, and so on. So if government needs to provide subsidies to farmers, then let us first understand what do we mean by subsidies. The World Trade Organization identifies and classifies four main types of subsidies. One is direct transfer of funds like grants and loans, or potential direct transfer of funds like loan guarantees. Government revenues that is otherwise due is foregone or not collected. If you've been following the debate around the crop loan waiver in many states, where state governments are asking the farmers to not return the loans that they have taken, or they're forgiven the interest rate payment of these loans. This is an example of a government revenue that is foregone or not being collected and is a type of subsidy. Provision of goods and services other than general infrastructure, income or price support. We will be talking mostly in this module about the fourth type of subsidy, which is income or price support. What is the function of farm subsidy? To make farming profitable enough for farmers to wish to invest sufficiently in technology to improve productivity per unit of land so that food security is not threatened. Policies are needed to encourage higher production and availability of food grains, so produced at lower prices. India's total domestic support for agricultural sector in 2010-11 was in US dollar terms $56.13 billion. Out of this, $13.81 billion was spent towards public stockholding for food security purposes. Now let's quickly talk about the agricultural pricing policy. Based on the recommendation made by the Commission for Agriculture Costs and Prices, Government of India announces minimum support price for key commodities. The recommended minimum support price is based on cost of production. The minimum support price is linked to not just the higher production costs that the farmers are experiencing every season, but also farming lobbies which frequently put pressure on the government to increase the price support that they obtain. The central government, under the price support policy, the central government extends price support for staple food grains such as rice, paddy, coarse grains, and wheat through the Food Corporation of India and state agencies. All the food grains conforming to the prescribed specifications offered for sale at specified centers are bought by the public procurement agencies at the minimum support price or MSP. The food grains so procured are allocated to the states for distribution to the identified beneficiaries under the targeted public distribution system and other welfare schemes at subsidized price. Hence, if you look at the purpose of the price support policy, it is essentially two-pronged. On one hand, to help farmers and encourage them to do productive farming. On the other hand, it is to support poorer people in the society by making transfers of subsidized grain to them under, at the moment, National Food Security Act and through the public distribution system. The difference between the economic cost of food grains and the issue prices incurred by the central government as the consumer subsidy. In addition to procuring food grains for meeting the requirements of the targeted public distribution system and welfare schemes, the central government is also under obligation to procure food grains for meeting the requirement of the buffer stock to ensure food security of the country. Hence, a portion of the total food subsidy also goes towards meeting the carrying cost of the buffer stock as buffer subsidy. One of the stated aims of agricultural price policy is to attain food security by protecting the employment and income of farmers by offering them remunerative prices for the crops grown. High rates of food inflation is a cause of concern for the poor and the vulnerable. Increase in domestic supply is necessary for providing food to the poor at reasonable prices and to run the PDS. Recent trends. Post-economic liberalization, declining public investment in domestic agriculture has affected farming yields and income. While cost of cultivation is steadily increasing, productivity gains have been limited. As a consequence, farmers are ever more dependent on price policy support or minimum support price to maintain production and compensate for reduced incomes. In recent years, increase in minimum support price has enabled farmers to maintain incomes in the face of rising cost of production. Liberalized trade regimes also affect minimum support price. High international food prices caused by low supplies can affect domestic food prices. In such a scenario, procuring food grains for maintaining food security becomes difficult. Government is forced to offer higher support price. Wheat in 1997, 2007, 2008, for example, when global prices come down, domestic politics makes it difficult for government to reduce high prices. Agricultural pricing policy has had a couple of successes, but it is not the only public policy instrument to ensure food security and security of farming livelihoods. It has been successful in providing around 20% margin to wheat and rice farmers over the cost of production. It has aided production, procurement, distribution. Farmers in turn have invested in technology and increased production. This has enabled sufficient procurement for buffer stocks. The current debate around the minimum support price throws some light on both the advantages and disadvantages of supporting farmers through only one particular subsidy instrument, which is price policy support. Set up in 2006, the Farmers Commission, led by the eminent agricultural scientist Professor M.S. Swaminathan, had recommended that the MSP for grains be fixed at production cost plus 50%. This was necessarily due to the high-risk nature of smallholder farming under rain-fed conditions and in the context of climate change. A more recent government panel has recommended that MSP be fixed only at the rate of 10%. The controversy over the settling up of MSP has led to indebted farmers' strike in several states all over the country in recent times. We have here a table which came out in a prominent newspaper recently, which shows the amount of cost that farmers are incurring in growing some important key crops, and including food grains and leguminous grains, as well as staple rice and wheat, and trying to understand the extent to which pricing subsidy is filling up the gap. And what it actually shows is that the farmers are incurring costs which are not getting compensated by the minimum support price at which the grains are being procured for them. Explanation: this table is being explained by showing how costs are calculated by looking at all the expenses that farmers incur in growing a crop and what amount of this expense is returned to them, in addition to the margin which ensures that farmers have a sustainable income which would keep them interested and which would keep them afloat and invested in agriculture as a sector. With that, we come to an end of this module, and what we have learned here essentially is, even when we look at a sector which is not directly concerned with social policy per se, something like agrarian issues is a very important cause of concern in the country, because a large number of people depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. Most of the people who are dependent on agriculture also happen to be from poorer sections of the community. Farmers as a whole, as a community, are also becoming poor because of large-scale fragmentation of landholding, declining public support in agriculture, natural hazards, and effects of climate change and global trade regimes. In such a scenario, protecting the farmers through public policy instruments might go a long way in also addressing social policy concerns. Instead of making more and more safety nets, supporting farmers more comprehensively might lead to both generation of employment, creating more secure sources of employment, and also reducing poverty in the society. Thank you.